Number 10. Cleopatra VII. Some queens become legendary because they ruled powerful kingdoms. Others become legendary because history never allowed them to remain only rulers. Cleopatra VII belongs to that second category. The last active ruler of Ptolemaic Egypt has survived in memory not simply as a queen, but as one of the most mythologized women in all of history. She has been remembered as seductress, strategist, survivor, manipulator, patriot, enchantress, and fatal symbol of a dying world. That alone makes her an ideal place to begin this list. Cleopatra did not merely sit on a throne. She ruled at the point where dynastic collapse, Roman expansion, personal charisma, and political danger all converged into something almost theatrical. What makes her especially haunting is the way fear and myth wrapped around her almost immediately. Cleopatra ruled in a world where kingdoms were devoured by stronger powers, where alliances were fragile, and where one wrong move could turn royalty into prey. She was highly intelligent, multilingual, politically calculating, and fully aware that Egypt could not survive Roman pressure through innocence. So she used everything available to her: diplomacy, symbolism, wealth, spectacle, lineage, and personal presence. To her enemies, especially Roman propagandists, that made her dangerous in a way they found easier to describe as unnatural. A woman who could influence men, shape empires, and defy Roman expectations had to be turned into a warning. That is where the darker version of Cleopatra begins. The historical queen was a ruler fighting for dynastic survival. The remembered Cleopatra became something more threatening, almost an embodiment of foreign luxury, feminine power, and political corruption all in one figure. Roman memory in particular helped create this image because it was useful to frame her not as a sovereign facing impossible circumstances, but as a seductive Eastern force capable of weakening great men. This is one of the oldest distortions in the history of female power. When a woman becomes too effective, hostile memory often rewrites her strength as enchantment and her intelligence as poison. But the darkness around Cleopatra is not only propaganda. Her reign truly was steeped in blood, instability, and the knowledge that the old world was closing around her. She moved through civil conflict, court rivalry, and one of history's great imperial transitions. She was tied to Julius Caesar, then to Mark Antony, and through those alliances became entangled in Rome's own savage struggles for supremacy. Every decision carried mortal risk. Every alliance could become fatal. The palace itself was not a place of peace, but a chamber of calculation where dynastic survival often meant that sentiment had to die before people did. And that is why Cleopatra takes the number 10 spot. She ruled through fear, not because she was a simple tyrant, but because her world was one in which weakness invited annihilation. Over time, that harsh reality fused with Roman propaganda, tragic romance, and the collapse of an ancient kingdom until the queen herself became almost impossible to see clearly. What remains is not just the woman but the dark silhouette history preferred. Beautiful, dangerous, politically lethal, and standing at the edge of a civilization's end. Cleopatra survives because she became more than a queen. She became the myth of a throne that could charm, terrify, and destroy all at once. Number 9, Olga of Kiev. Some queens are remembered because they inherited power. Others are remembered because they seized the emotional temperature of an entire age and turned it into vengeance. Olga of Kiev belongs to that second category. Long before she became associated with sainthood in later tradition, she entered historical memory through one of the most chilling revenge narratives ever attached to a ruler. After the killing of her husband, Prince Igor, the stories surrounding Olga present her not as a grieving widow broken by loss, but as a calculating avenger who answered insult and murder with a sequence of punishments so coldly staged that they transformed her into something almost mythic. That is what makes her so unforgettable. In the most famous tradition, Olga does not simply retaliate once. She retaliates repeatedly, with each act carrying its own ritual humiliation and psychological force. Messengers are buried alive, others are burned. A city is destroyed through a method so strange and memorable that it feels designed for legend as much as history. Whether every detail reached us exactly as it happened is not really the main point. The reason the story endured is that it captured a terrifying image of rulership. Olga's power was not loud, impulsive, or chaotic. It was deliberate. She made revenge look ceremonial. This is where fear and myth fuse completely. Olga ruled in a violent frontier world where dynastic authority depended heavily on strength, deterrence, and the ability to answer rebellion without hesitation. In such a setting, mercy could be read as weakness, and weakness could invite collapse. That helps explain why her vengeance narrative became so powerful. It was not just about emotion, it was about restoring authority through terror. The queen had to prove that the death of a ruler would not open the door to contempt. So the avenger became the sovereign, and the sovereign became the lesson everyone else was expected to remember. What makes Olga especially interesting for this list is the contrast between the darkness of her early legend and the later transformation of her image. History preserved her not only as a merciless avenger, but eventually as a Christian ruler associated with conversion and sanctity. That dual memory is extraordinary. The same woman can appear in one register as almost apocalyptic in her revenge and in another as spiritually important and foundational. This is exactly the kind of tension that creates lasting fascination. A queen who fits neatly into one moral category can be understood. A queen who seems to contain both brutality and sacred legacy becomes much harder to forget. And that is why Olga of Kiev takes the number 9 spot. She ruled through fear, restored power through blood, and entered memory through acts of vengeance so severe that they feel suspended between chronicle and legend. But she did not remain frozen there. Later history layered holiness over terror, creating a figure who cannot be reduced to either one completely. What remains is one of the most unsettling royal images in early medieval history. A queen whose enemies learned too late that widowhood did not make her vulnerable. It made her dangerous. Number 8. Fredegund. Some queens become feared because they lead armies. Others become feared because they master something quieter and, in many ways, more terrifying: the court. Fredegund belongs to that second category. Rising from comparatively humble origins to become queen in the brutal world of Merovingian Francia, she survives in history with the atmosphere of a woman who understood that palaces could be more dangerous than battlefields. Her name is tied to intrigue, rivalry, assassination, dynastic struggle, and the kind of cold political survival that makes later generations unsure whether they are looking at a ruler, a conspirator, or a legend shaped by hostile memory. In a court already soaked in blood, Fredegund did not merely endure, she became one of its darkest forces. What makes her so unsettling is the intensity of the rivalry that surrounds her story, especially her conflict with Brunhilde, another formidable queen whose long struggle with Fredegund helped turn Merovingian politics into something close to dynastic nightmare. This was not a world of polite royal disagreement. It was a world in which marriages were political weapons, children were future claimants, loyalties shifted constantly, and murder could become part of statecraft. In that environment, Fredegund's reputation hardened around the idea of ruthless initiative. She was remembered not as a passive figure swept along by events, but as a woman willing to move first, strike hard, and remove threats before they could destroy her. That is where fear enters fully into her image. Fredegund becomes one of those rulers whose power seems inseparable from suspicion. Enemies die, rivals fall. The court becomes a place where smiles and death can exist very close together. Whether every accusation made against her by chroniclers deserves equal confidence is another question, because women in power, especially in violent early medieval courts, were often described in ways that amplified treachery, sexuality, or unnatural cruelty. But even after allowing for exaggeration, something dark remains. Fredegund ruled in a system where hesitation could be fatal, and she appears to have understood that with frightening clarity. She is especially fitting for this list because her memory feels soaked in the logic of bloodline politics. Her struggles were not abstract. They were about succession, legitimacy, survival, and the future of royal children in a world where a throne could become a death sentence for the unprotected. That is part of what makes queens like Fredegund so haunting. Their cruelty, whether fully deserved in the record or sharpened by hostile sources, emerges from a landscape where power was intimate and hereditary. To destroy a rival was not only to remove a person, it was to reshape the future of a dynasty. That makes every act feel larger, colder, and more consequential. And that is why Fredegund stands at number 8. She ruled through fear, not with grand imperial spectacle, but through the suffocating pressure of court violence, dynastic hatred, and whispered danger. Over time, the historical queen and the dark legend fused together until she came to represent a specific kind of royal horror. The queen as survivor of a blood-soaked palace, the woman who learned how power truly worked and answered it without mercy. In Fredegund's world, the crown did not protect innocence. It rewarded those who could outlive it. Number 7. Empress Theodora. Some queens and empresses are remembered because they were born to power. Others are remembered because they came from outside its expected boundaries and seized it so completely that later generations never stopped arguing about what they really were. Empress Theodora belongs to that second category, rising from deeply controversial beginnings to become one of the most powerful women in the Byzantine world. She survives in history with an aura unlike almost any other ruler on this list. To some, she was brilliant, formidable, and indispensable. To others, she was dangerous, manipulative, and almost unnaturally forceful. That tension is exactly what makes her unforgettable. Theodora did not simply enter imperial power. She altered its atmosphere. What gives her such a dark and compelling place in memory is the combination of intelligence, will, and ruthlessness that seems to define her role at court. The Byzantine Empire was not a place where power could be held lightly. It was a world of factions, theology, riot, military pressure, ceremonial magnificence, and constant danger. To survive, there required more than charm or legitimacy. It required nerve. Theodora appears in that setting as a woman who understood both the spectacle and the violence of imperial rule. She could be politically sharp, morally hard, and capable of influencing the emperor himself at moments when hesitation might have meant collapse. The most famous example, of course, is the Nika Revolt. In the memory that followed, Theodora's role during the crisis became central to her legend. At a moment when retreat seemed possible, even tempting, she is remembered as the voice urging endurance, power, and refusal. Whether every line later attributed to her was preserved perfectly is less important than the image that survived. An empress who looked at chaos closing around the throne and answered not with fear, but with iron. That is one of the great turning points in how rulers become larger than life. The moment danger reveals not weakness, but a terrifying steadiness. But Theodora's darkness in memory does not come only from strength. It also comes from the hostility of sources and the inability of many observers, ancient and later, to decide whether a woman like her should be admired or feared. A powerful empress who had risen from outside elite expectation could easily be described as corrupting, manipulative, or monstrous, especially by writers determined to frame female influence as a threat to proper order. This means her legend is shaped by both her real force and the anxiety she provoked. As with many women on this list, myth and power feed each other. The stronger she appears, the more opponents feel compelled to darken her image. And that is why Empress Theodora takes the number 7 spot. She ruled through fear, not necessarily by bathing the throne in obvious bloodshed, but by becoming the kind of imperial presence no one could ignore. A woman whose resolve could harden the center of an empire in crisis. Over time, she became more than empress. She became an argument about female power itself, about whether intelligence and ruthlessness in a woman should be called strength or menace. That unresolved question is what keeps her alive in dark historical memory. Theodora remains haunting because she did what so many feared a woman might do if given the throne. She proved fully capable of wielding it. Number 6. Boudica. Some queens become dark legends because they ruled from established thrones. Others become dark legends because they rose out of catastrophe and turned grief into war. Boudica belongs to that second category. The warrior queen of the Iceni survives in historical memory not as a quiet ruler maintaining order, but as a figure of uprising, fire, and vengeance. After Roman abuse, humiliation, and violence against her family, she became the center of one of the most explosive revolts in Roman Britain. That origin matters. Boudica's legend does not begin in palace intrigue or dynastic ritual. It begins in outrage so severe that it transformed a queen into an instrument of revenge against an empire. That is part of what gives her story such enduring force. Boudica is remembered not merely as a rebel leader, but as the embodiment of a people's fury made visible. In later imagination, she appears almost elemental, a queen riding at the front of destruction, cities burning behind her, Roman certainty collapsing in the face of something they had not fully understood. This is how certain historical women become larger than life. Once they are attached to uprising, humiliation, and retaliatory violence on a civilizational scale, the individual and the symbol begin to merge. Boudica stops being only a ruler. She becomes vengeance with a name. What makes her especially fitting for this list is the atmosphere of fear around her memory. To Rome, she could be framed as savage rebellion, a terrifying woman presiding over chaos and bloodshed. To later audiences, she could become patriot, avenger, or anti-imperial icon. But none of those versions fully remove the darkness. Even heroic memory leaves intact the image of a queen whose answer to injustice was devastating violence. Settlements were attacked, Roman lives were destroyed. The revolt was not symbolic. It was brutal, and its brutality is part of why it endured in memory with such intensity. There is also a tragic edge that deepens the myth. Boudica's revolt shook Roman Britain, but it did not last. Like many figures who enter legend through resistance, she becomes unforgettable partly because her fury could wound empire without permanently overthrowing it. That incompletion matters. A total victor can be historic, but a nearly apocalyptic challenger who erupts, terrifies, and then vanishes into uncertain finality often becomes something more haunting. Boudica's end is shadowed, and that shadow only strengthens the aura around her. She appears, burns across the historical record, and then recedes before she can be contained by a calm ending. And that is why Boudica takes the number 6 spot. She ruled through fear not in the long administrative sense of a courtly monarch, but through the sudden and catastrophic force of rebellion turned personal. Her legend is soaked in humiliation answered by blood. In empire confronted by a woman it could not dismiss until too late. What remains is one of history's most powerful dark royal images. Not a queen preserving peace, but a queen who turned pain into war and left behind a memory as fierce as the fires attached to her name. Number 5. Queen Tamar. Some queens become dark in memory because they are accused of cruelty. Others become dark in a more complex way, because their reign grows so large, so powerful and so wrapped in national myth that later generations can no longer separate the ruler from the almost sacred aura surrounding the throne. Queen Tamar belongs to that second category. One of the most celebrated rulers in Georgian history, she is often remembered as the sovereign of a golden age, a queen under whom political strength, military success, and cultural prestige flourished together. But that bright memory should not hide the harder truth beneath it. Tamar ruled in a world where kingship, warfare, dynastic legitimacy, and sacred authority were inseparable and where survival at the top required formidable will. That is what makes her such an intriguing inclusion on this list. Tamar is not dark in the same way as a revenge queen or a palace conspirator. Her darkness lies in the sheer scale and intensity of royal authority surrounding her image. She was a woman on a throne in a medieval Christian world that did not automatically make space for female supremacy, and yet she did not simply occupy power. She consolidated it. She outlasted resistance, commanded loyalty, and presided over military and political successes that made her rule feel almost providential in hindsight. A queen who can do that inevitably begins to gather myth around herself, and myth always casts shadows, as well as light. Part of Tamar's power came from the way she was positioned above ordinary gender expectations. Later memory often elevated her almost beyond womanhood in the political sense, stressing titles and forms of rulership that aligned her with kingly sovereignty rather than merely feminine queenship. That is revealing. Societies often struggle to describe exceptionally powerful women without shifting them into a category that feels more acceptable to their political imagination. But this process also makes them stranger. Tamar becomes not just a queen, but a near-sacral ruler whose authority seems touched by destiny. Once that happens, the person starts to disappear behind the monumental image. Her reign also stood close to war, expansion, and the assertion of dominance. However cultured and celebrated the age may appear in retrospective memory, it was still sustained by force. Armies marched, rivals were defeated, regional power was asserted. Court authority had to be maintained. Tamar's greatness, in other words, was not passive. It depended on the ability to rule in a world where thrones were never secured by admiration alone. That gives her memory an edge often overlooked in simpler heroic portraits. Golden ages are usually brighter in hindsight than they felt to those living inside their struggles. Behind the splendor was steel. And that is why Queen Tamar takes the number 5 spot. She ruled through myth as much as through fear, but the myth itself was part of the power. It lifted her above rivals, above ordinary categories, and into the realm of almost sacred monarchy. Yet beneath that elevated memory was a ruler who had to survive, command, and dominate in a harsh political world. Tamar remains haunting not because she fits easily into the image of a blood-soaked tyrant, but because she shows another path to dark royal immortality. The queen whose greatness became so immense that history stopped remembering a woman on a throne and started remembering the throne itself as something almost supernatural. Number 4, Ranavalona I. Some queens are remembered as dark because hostile enemies exaggerated their cruelty. Others are remembered as dark because even after exaggeration is stripped away, something severe and unsettling still remains. Ranavalona I belongs to that second category. The 19th century ruler of Madagascar has survived in historical memory as one of the most feared queens in the world, a sovereign whose reign became associated with isolation, repression, harsh punishment, and the belief that authority had to be defended through terror if it was to survive at all. She is one of the clearest examples of how a throne can become inseparable from fear. What makes Ranavalona especially disturbing is that her reign unfolded in a world where outside influence, internal loyalty, spiritual legitimacy, and state survival all seemed bound together. Madagascar was not standing outside history in some untouched calm. It was a kingdom facing immense pressure, both from within and from foreign powers whose presence brought religion, trade, political expectation, and the slow threat of domination. Ranavalona answered that world not with accommodation, but with a ferocious insistence on control. Foreign influence was restricted. Converts, rivals, and suspected enemies could be punished brutally. The monarchy would survive, but only on terms she dictated. That response is part of what gives her reign such a chilling atmosphere. She did not rule through one dramatic act of vengeance or one famous war alone. She ruled through sustained pressure, through the cultivation of obedience, and through the use of punishment as a political climate. In many accounts, the fear surrounding her was not accidental. it was functional. Terror became a method of holding the kingdom together, or at least of forcing it into submission beneath the crown. This is one of the darkest forms royal power can take. Not the sudden violence of revolt or execution, but the slow creation of a society in which everyone understands that the sovereign's displeasure can reach anywhere. Ranavalona also survives in memory because her image sits uneasily between resistance and cruelty. To some later observers, she appears as a ruler defending her kingdom's independence against the encroaching reach of foreign empires and missionaries. To others, she appears as a tyrant whose determination to resist outside influence hardened into paranoia, suffering, and blood. Both elements matter because they are what make her so difficult to reduce to a single moral category. A queen protecting sovereignty can still become monstrous in how she chooses to protect it. That is exactly the contradiction that gives dark rulers their enduring force in history, and that is why Ranavalona I takes the number 4 spot. She ruled through fear not as a brief avenger or symbolic rebel, but as a monarch who made dread part of governance itself. Her reign left behind the image of a kingdom turned inward under a queen whose will seemed immovable, whose punishments were remembered with horror, and whose name became almost synonymous with the dangerous edge of absolute power. Ranavalona remains haunting because she shows how easily the defense of a throne can become the justification for turning an entire realm into an atmosphere of fear. Number 3. Catherine de' Medici. Some queens are remembered as monsters because they truly governed through blood. Others are remembered as monsters because they lived at the center of such a violent age that history could no longer tell where policy ended and darkness began. Catherine de' Medici belongs to that second and more complex category. As queen consort and later one of the most powerful figures in 16th century France, she survives in memory surrounded by poison, massacre, court intrigue, religious bloodshed, and the constant suspicion that behind every royal decision stood a woman whose intelligence had turned cold enough to manage chaos through fear. Whether every charge against her is fair is not the point. The point is that her name became a vessel for an entire century's anxieties about female power and political blood. What makes Catherine so haunting is the setting in which she ruled. France during the wars of religion was a kingdom balanced over an abyss. Catholics and Protestants were locked in cycles of distrust and violence, noble factions maneuvered for influence. The crown itself was fragile, threatened not only by external danger, but by the possibility of internal fracture at every level. In such a world, simply preserving the monarchy could require compromise, manipulation, deception, and at times ruthless calculation. Catherine emerges from that environment as a queen mother who understood that softness could mean collapse. Whether admired or condemned, she never appears politically innocent. That is why fear clung to her so tightly. Catherine was associated with courtly intelligence of the most dangerous kind, the intelligence that smiles, negotiates, arranges marriages, shifts alliances, and never stops calculating who may become tomorrow's threat. In popular memory, this easily hardened into the darker myth of the Poison Queen, the woman behind curtains, the hidden hand in every lethal intrigue. Much of that image was sharpened by propaganda and by later hostility toward powerful women, but it endured because it fit the emotional truth of her age. The court around Catherine really was a place where ceremony, beauty, and death could exist side by side. No event binds her more strongly to blood-soaked memory than the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. The exact scope of her intention and responsibility has been argued for centuries, but her name became inseparable from the catastrophe. That matters because historical legend does not always wait for perfect certainty. Once a queen becomes linked in public memory to one of the most horrifying explosions of violence in her age, the myth forms almost by itself. Catherine ceases to be only a regent navigating impossible pressures. She becomes the face of royal calculation curdling into massacre, the embodiment of the idea that court politics can become indistinguishable from slaughter. And that is why Catherine de' Medici stands at number 3. She ruled through fear, myth, and blood, not because she can be reduced to a cartoon villain, but because she sat at the exact point where dynastic survival, religious hatred, propaganda, and female authority collided. Over time, history transformed her into one of the darkest queens in European memory, a woman whose intelligence seemed inseparable from suspicion and whose name became a shadow cast across an age of knives. Catherine remains unforgettable because she represents one of history's most unsettling possibilities, that a throne can remain elegant on the surface while blood quietly gathers beneath it. Number 2. Zetian. Some queens are remembered as dark because they ruled through vengeance. Others are remembered as dark because they did something even more unsettling. They took a system built to exclude them, mastered it completely, and then bent it to their own image. Zetian belongs to that second category. The only woman in Chinese history to rule in her own name as emperor, she survives in memory as one of the most formidable, controversial, and myth-laden figures ever to sit on a throne. Her rise alone feels almost unbelievable. She entered the imperial world from within the harem structure, moved through the deadly currents of court politics, outlasted rivals, and eventually stood not beside power, but at its center. That is part of what makes her so haunting. Zetian was not merely a queen consort or regent exercising temporary influence. She crossed the final boundary and claimed sovereign authority in a world where that act itself would be remembered as unnatural by many who came after her. Once a woman seizes the highest political identity in a deeply patriarchal imperial order, myth begins attaching itself almost immediately. The historical ruler becomes inseparable from accusation. Ruthlessness becomes central to the story, because later memory often refuses to believe that a woman could have reached that height by intelligence, discipline, and political mastery alone. So the darker narrative grows. Rivals eliminated, enemies crushed, terror used, loyalty enforced. And yet in Zetian's case, the darker narrative cannot be dismissed as pure invention. Her reign really was marked by hard control, surveillance, political purges, and the calculated management of the court. She understood that extraordinary power, especially power seized rather than inherited in the accepted way, could not survive on symbolism alone. It had to be defended relentlessly. That meant weakening hostile aristocratic factions, elevating new talent, using the machinery of the state to protect her position, and ensuring that danger was detected before it could fully emerge. This is one of the coldest truths about rulers like Zetian. Once they reach the throne, they often have to become even more formidable than their enemies expected, because any sign of softness would be read as proof that they never belonged there. What deepens her legend further is the way her reign sits between effectiveness and fear. Zetian was not remembered only as a destroyer of rivals. She was also associated with capable governance, administrative reach, and the strengthening of imperial power. That combination is precisely what makes her so difficult to reduce to a single moral judgment. She was not a failed tyrant lashing out blindly. She was a successful ruler whose success itself made her more threatening to those who wished to cast her as monstrous. The stronger she appears in history, the darker some traditions feel compelled to make her. That tension is why her image has endured with such force for centuries, and that is why Zetian takes the number 2 spot. She ruled through fear, myth, and blood in one of the most complete and politically sophisticated ways on this list. She did not merely survive the palace, she conquered it. She did not merely influence the state, she became it. Over time, the Empress and the legend fused together until what remained was one of history's most intimidating royal silhouettes, a woman who turned exclusion into dominance and left behind a memory so powerful that admirers and enemies alike could never stop writing about her. Zetian remains unforgettable because she proved that the throne could be taken, held, and transformed by a queen strong enough to make an empire fear her. Number 1. Tomyris. Some queens become dark legends because they ruled through intrigue. Others become dark legends because they stood against one of the greatest conquerors in history and answered imperial ambition with blood so memorable that the story could never remain ordinary. Tomyris belongs to that second and highest category. The warrior queen of the Massagetae survives in memory above all through her clash with Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Empire. Whether every detail of the most famous version reached us untouched is almost beside the point now. What matters is the image that endured, a queen whose son was lost through Persian strategy, whose grief hardened into vengeance, and who then defeated the conqueror so completely that later tradition remembered her as making him drink his fill of blood. That is one of the most unforgettable royal images in all of ancient history. Tomyris is not remembered as a decorative queen, nor as a ruler cautiously negotiating survival on the edge of empire. She is remembered as direct refusal. Cyrus comes east with imperial confidence, and instead of submission he finds resistance shaped by rage, sovereignty, and a woman who will not allow conquest to be written as destiny. The power of the story lies in its reversal. The great empire builder, the man before whom so many kingdoms fell, meets a queen who answers loss with annihilating force. Once a narrative reaches that level of symbolic violence, it stops being mere chronicle. It becomes legend. What makes Tomyris especially deserving of the #1 spot is the purity of the fear attached to her memory. She does not need the palace poisonings of a court queen or the administrative terror of an imperial ruler to become frightening. Her power is simpler and in some ways more primal. She is the sovereign who cannot be deceived into surrender, the mother whose loss becomes war, the queen whose authority is fused with retaliation so absolute that later generations preserved it almost like a warning. In many traditions, male conquerors are allowed ambition, while female rulers are expected to defend or endure. Tomyris breaks that pattern completely. She does not merely defend. She destroys the invader's myth of invincibility. There is also something deeper in why her legend lasted. Tomyris stands at the intersection of empire and frontier, civilization and so-called barbarian otherness, male conquest and female vengeance. That makes her perfect material for historical memory. To some, she could be portrayed as savage, to others as just, to still others as the rare figure who exposed the arrogance of empire by forcing it to confront a ruler it had fatally underestimated. This is exactly how dark queens become immortal. They are remembered not only for what they did, but for the symbolic order they shattered. Tomyris did not simply win a war. In legend, she proved that conquest itself could bleed, and that is why Tomyris takes the #1 spot. She ruled through fear, myth, and blood in the most archetypal way imaginable, not as a hidden manipulator and not as a court survivor, but as a queen whose vengeance entered the permanent imagination of history. Whether one approaches her through ancient sources, later retellings, or modern fascination, the result is the same. Her image towers above the story, a ruler standing over the broken body of imperial ambition, answering a conqueror with the language he brought to others. Tomyris remains unforgettable because she represents one of history's darkest and most powerful reversals, the moment when the queen was not the victim of empire, but the nightmare waiting for it.